There's a kind of silence that feels different from all the others, the kind that doesn't just sit quietly in a room but presses in, slowly, almost like it has weight. And if you've ever watched All in the Family closely, especially those episodes where nothing seems to be happening on the surface, you start to realize that silence in that show is never empty. It's never just a pause, it's usually the loudest thing in the room. And sometimes it becomes something else entirely, something sharper, something that feels like an accusation, without anyone actually saying the words out loud. There's one kind of episode that captures this feeling perfectly, where the situation itself is almost deceptively simple. Something like a misunderstanding, or a piece of news that lands awkwardly, or even just a small comment that doesn't quite sit right. And the scene begins in the familiar way. The living room, the same arrangement, the same sense of routine that makes everything feel grounded. Archie is there, of course, settling into his chair like he owns not just the space but the meaning of everything that happens in it. And Mike is nearby, already carrying his own perspective, his own readiness to challenge, even if he hasn't said anything yet. Gloria moves between them, aware of the tension even before it fully forms, and with her gentle presence tries to keep everything connected, tries to keep the room feeling like a home rather than a... At first, there's talking, actual conversation, something that resembles an exchange. But then something shifts. Maybe Archie says something that lands a little harder than expected. Maybe Mike chooses not to respond right away, and that's where it begins, that silence. It's not long, not at first, just a beat, just a pause where everyone seems to be waiting. And in that waiting, something starts to build because no one fills the space. Archie notices it, even if he doesn't show it directly, and instead of softening, instead of stepping back, he leans into it, interprets the silence as resistance, as judgment, as something directed at him. Mike stays quiet a little longer, maybe because he's thinking, maybe because he's choosing not to escalate, but that quiet becomes something else in Archie's mind. It becomes a kind of challenge, a refusal to engage, a statement without words. And that's where the silence changes, where it stops being neutral and starts to feel loaded, where it carries meaning that no one has actually spoken but everyone seems to understand. Gloria senses it, tries to step in, tries to break the moment with something lighter, something that could redirect the energy, but even her voice feels like it's entering a space that's already been defined by that silence. Add something kind, something gentle, but even that doesn't quite land the way it normally would, because the room has already shifted, already settled into this strange, tense quiet. Archie speaks again, and now there's something different in his tone, something sharper, something more defensive, because he's responding not just to what's been said, but to what hasn't been said. Mike finally replies, but now his words carry the weight of that silence. They feel more pointed, more deliberate, even if he's still trying to be reasonable, still trying to explain. And just like that, the conversation isn't really a conversation anymore. It's a response to a silence that has already shaped the direction of everything. This is where the show becomes incredibly precise in its understanding of human behavior, because it recognizes that sometimes what isn't said can be more powerful than what is. That silence can feel like judgment, like rejection, like accusation, even if that's not what was intended. The living room becomes almost like a container for that feeling, holding it in, amplifying it, making it impossible to ignore, because there's nowhere else for it to go. Archie's worldview plays a huge role here because he doesn't just hear words. He interprets reactions, pauses, hesitations, and when those things don't align with his expectations, they become threats, things he needs to push back against. Mike challenges him, but even his silence becomes part of that challenge. Because in not responding immediately, in taking that moment, he creates space for Archie to project meaning onto it. Gloria tries to navigate between them, but even she gets pulled into the tension, her attempts to smooth things over becoming less effective as the silence continues to shape the interaction. And always tries to bring warmth back into the room, tries to remind everyone of their connection, but even her kindness feels like it's moving through something thick, something resistant. The humor in these moments is subtle, almost uncomfortable because it comes from recognition, from the realization that this is how people actually behave, how they misinterpret each other, how they fill in gaps with assumptions. There's something almost absurd about it, the way a simple pause can spiral into something much bigger, the way silence can become a kind of argument all on its own. But it never feels exaggerated, it feels real. And that's part of what made the show so groundbreaking, especially in the context of the 1970s, because it wasn't just presenting issues, it was presenting the way people struggle to talk about those issues, the way communication breaks down in small, almost invisible ways. It trusted the audience to notice those moments, to feel them, to sit with the discomfort rather than rushing past it. As the scene continues, the silence doesn't disappear, it changes. It becomes part of the rhythm, part of the back and forth, shaping every response, every reaction. Archie becomes more insistent, not just because of what's being said, but because of what he thinks is being implied. And Mike, in turn, becomes more direct, more focused on clarifying his position. But the more they talk, the more it feels like they're responding to something that isn't fully there, something that started in that initial silence and never quite went away. Gloria's frustration grows, not because she disagrees with one side or the other, but because she can see how the conversation is being pulled off course by something that isn't being addressed directly. And in her quiet way, continues to offer moments of softness, moments where the tension eases just slightly, but never enough to fully break the pattern. This is where the show really leans into discomfort as a form of comedy, because there's no easy release, no clear punchline that resolves the tension, just a slow, steady build of awkwardness and miscommunication. You might find yourself laughing, but it's a different kind of laughter, one that comes with a slight hesitation, a recognition of how familiar this all feels. And even now, watching it decades later, it still resonates, because these dynamics haven't changed. People still misread each other, still let silence carry more meaning than it should, still turn pauses into accusations. As the episode moves toward its conclusion, there's no big moment of realization, no sudden clarity that resolves everything, just a gradual easing of the intensity, not because the issue has been solved, but because the characters have simply run out of energy. The silence returns, but now it feels different again, less charged, more tired, like the room itself has exhaled. And in that quiet, there's a sense of something unfinished, something that will likely come up again in another conversation, in another moment. Personally, I find these episodes some of the most compelling because they don't rely on obvious conflict or dramatic twists. They focus on something more subtle, more relatable, the way communication can break down in ways that are almost invisible. They remind you that sometimes the most important part of a conversation is what's said, but how it's heard, how it's interpreted, how it's shaped by everything that isn't spoken. And that's where All in the Family still feels incredibly relevant, because it captures something that goes beyond its time, something that continues to define how people interact, how they misunderstand, how they struggle to connect. So the scene fades, the room settles, and you're left with that lingering sense of tension. Not overwhelming, not dramatic, just present, like a question that hasn't been answered. And maybe that's the point, not to resolve it, not to fix it, but to notice it, to recognize how easily silence can become something more, how quickly it can shift from a pause into a statement, into an accusation that no one ever actually said.